So hi everyone. I just want to start by saying that I'm really happy to be here. I've been looking forward to this. And I'm going to try to sort of pick up where Anna left off. So some of you will probably see some of the things that I will be talking about will somehow be overlapping. So for example, I will be speaking about solidarity as well and post-migrant alliances. But whereas Anna was speaking about artistic practice, I will be kind of shifting focus now and talking about curatorial practices. I will be focusing on a specific curatorial case, namely CAMP, Center for Art on Migration Politics, and you can see the space here in the images that I've shown here on this slide. CAMP was a non-profit exhibition space dealing with topics such as migration, asylum, and integration. So again, here you will see the overlapping topics. The exhibition space was uniquely based in the Trampoline House, a self-organized community center located in the highly diverse northwest part of Copenhagen. From 2015 to 2020, it functioned as a meeting place for refugees, asylum seekers, volunteers, and citizens of Copenhagen. 3 to 4 days a week, the house offered various activities, legal classes, job training, children's club, and importantly, also a space for conviviality, and this is something that I will come back to because this is quite central. By creating a hospitable zone of contact, the community center helped to break the sense of isolation that Anna was also talking about, and reduce the sense of powerlessness that many refugees and asylum seekers experience during their months and often years of actually waiting in the Danish asylum system while their asylum application is being processed. Thanks to CAMP's embedded position within Trampoline House, the gallery evolved into a mixed contact zone where gallery goers, artists, intellectuals, activists, but also refugees, asylum seekers, and regular users, volunteers, and the staff working at the Trampoline House came together within the framework of CAMP's programs of exhibitions and politically mobilizing events as well. Seeking to actively explore the potentials of sort of interconnecting these different platforms, CAMP has developed a locally embedded, globally connected, and clearly also very clearly also a politically positioned approach to curating. And it has addressed not just art audiences, but a plurality of publics, and this is also something that I will come back to. In doing so, they followed in the footsteps of curators such as Queen Visa, whose influential and groundbreaking mega exhibition, Documenta 11 in 2002, set a new course for politically engaged curators by introducing new ways of linking art exhibitions closely to other kinds of platforms and types of critical engagement, including activist mobilization. The founders of CAMP, I don't have an image of them, but it's two women that have been running CAMP, namely Frederikke Hansen and Naika Foroutan. And they go under the name, as a team, they go under the name of Curatorial, which literally translates curatorial action. Their approach to curating resonates with that of other collectives, such as the one explored by One Grupa, a Jakarta-based collective established in 2000. Curatorial has collaborated with One Grupa on several occasions, and importantly, now that we're talking about also the legacy of Queen Visa, they've been collaborating in connection with the upcoming Documenta 15, which will take place next year. So in the closing of the physical gallery space of CAMP in 2020, that is last year, this event also coincided with Curatorial's increasing engagement in the preparations of Documenta 15. And I'm going to briefly return to that and also talk a bit about the implications of this in the end of my presentation. So, in my presentation today, I will explore how CAMP has succeeded in radically developing the kind of critical curatorial model that Envesa introduced by embedding it in politically engaged community work and by linking it to activism. Also, I will argue that as a so-called post-migrant public space, CAMP has a strong precedent in Invisa's realization of Documenta 11 as a constellation of public spheres. That's kind of his term when he refers to his curatorial project. And also to Invisa's idea of the exhibition as, and I quote again, a forum of public discovery of art's potential in the face of difficulty, unquote. So in other words, CAMP's activities have been developed from this clear sense of both social and political urgency in an age of globalization and migration. It's great that it works. So my presentation will fall in 4 parts. The first part will focus on Invisa's platforms model and reflect on his organization of Documenta 11 as a globally distributed network of interconnected platforms contributing to the rethinking of the relationship between the exhibition itself, as it's traditionally understood as kind of the core events, and then the exhibition-related events perceived as collateral add-ons. Second, I will explore how CAMP has successfully translated this model to a small-scale art institution. So the issue of scale is something that I will be coming back to. Following this line of thought, I will then, in the third part of my presentation, zoom in on a specific case, namely decolonizing appearance, and examine how this exhibition project worked across multiple platforms. In the fourth part of my presentation, I will reflect on this idea of post-migrant public spaces to examine how CAMP has managed to create a transcultural contact zone and address not just traditional art audiences, but also a plurality of publics. Yeah. So now turning attention to Documenta, going back in time to 2002. As Charles Green and Anthony Gardner have noted in their recently published book entitled Biannuals, Triennials, and Documenta, Documenta 11 is widely considered to be one of the most important exhibitions in recent decades, recognized for its post-colonial agenda, its sensitivity to geographic dispersion of contemporary art in the so-called Global South, as well as for its experimentation with these kinds of should we continue? Yeah. These kind of collective curatorial practices. Invisa organized Documenta 11 together with a group of 6 co-curators. As this curatorial team included professionals with various Western and non-Western backgrounds, it countered this perception of the West as the center and the non-West as the periphery, and it emphasized that the art world is profoundly entangled and culturally pluralized. So in the following, I will concentrate on one key aspect, because of course there are lots of things you can talk about when speaking about such a large, gigantic actually, curatorial project, but I will concentrate on one key aspect underpinning the realization of Documenta 11, namely the creation of a series of platforms for political intervention. Instead of only staging a show in Documenta's home city Kassel in Germany, Invisa and his team, they chose to disperse the exhibition-related activities, such as conferences and debates and workshops. These activities were conceived as interventions into current theoretical and political debates, and they were far more comprehensive than the type of events program that have traditionally been realized in connection with major international exhibitions and biennials. Of course, this has also changed, partly due to the inspiration actually of Invisa's project. So the platforms. Documenta 11's activities were distributed across 5 connected forums, or platforms, as Invisa has called them. Taking place successively over the course of 1 year, these platforms facilitated a durational approach to curating. And this, I think, is a key word that we will probably, I hope, be coming back to as well. Also, the platforms were spread across the globe, each located in a different nation. So I won't be going into details now, but I just put these on a slide to give you an impression of the different platforms. So you can also see some of the titles. So there's Democracy Unrealized, there was Experiments with Truth, Transitional Justice and the Processes of Truth and Reconciliation, Creolity and Creolization, and Under Siege, 4 African cities, Freetown, Johannesburg, Kinshasa and Lagos. So this is just to give you an impression of this social and political urgency that we see here. But also I thought it would be interesting to mention where they took place. So you can see here, for example, the first one took place in Vienna and in Berlin, the next one in New Delhi, the third one in San Lucia in the Caribbean, and the fourth one in Kinshasa, Lagos, and then the fifth one, the final one, was in Kassel in Germany. So a lot of different topics being discussed with a political agenda, and a lot of different locations that were activated in this process. So in this way, together with its curatorial team, Inviza sought to decentralize the exhibition format. As noted by Green and Gardner, Documenta 11 in this way presented contemporary art as a network in which cities of the global south and the global north were equally important to the contemporary canon, as opposed to this idea of some centers being perceived as exotic margins and others as more genuinely cosmopolitan and contemporary art scenes. So at the 5 platforms, participants from many different corners of the world contributed to the production of knowledge and the development of critical agendas. More than 80 participants from different disciplines such as writers, political scientists, philosophers, artists, architects, lawyers, political activists, researchers, and other cultural practitioners engaged in lectures, debates, and panel discussions. We were actually just before the event started tonight talking about interdisciplinarity and different approaches, so this is something that is quite characteristic of the way in which Inviza works. Importantly, in this context, the knowledge-producing activities of the first 4 platforms didn't just function as kind of add-ons to the subsequent mega exhibition in Kassel, or as a preparative discursive program leading up to the actual curatorial event. Nor were the conference books which were published after the exhibition viewed as mere documentation. Rather, all the platforms were perceived by Inviza as integral to and equally important components of the curatorial project. In this way, by thinking of Documenta 11 as a non-hierarchical network of platforms for knowledge production, spanning locations all around the world and taking place successively over the duration of a whole year, Inviza's curatorial practice contributed to rethinking the exhibition venue and the relationship between exhibition and exhibition-related events in new ways. But that's of course also critique, so this is what we're coming to now. Many of Inviza's curatorial projects, and he has done a lot, such as the second Johannesburg Biennial, which was in 1997, Documenta 11, the one that I've been talking about now, which was in 2002, and All the World's Futures, which was the 56th Biennial in Venice, realized in 2015. So all of these projects have sought to somehow, and in different ways of course, transgress traditional boundaries in terms of institutions, publics, exhibition venues, and forms of artistic practice. It's important to note, however, that Inviza in most of these cases operated from within the highly institutionalized context of the mega exhibition. And this is quite central, I would argue. In this way, he contributed to the booming of the global art industry and benefited from substantial budgets, large audiences, and of course also kind of extensive media attention. Also, one could add, he kind of fit in as well to the proliferation of these within academia, this interest of relating to post-colonial agendas as well that were prevalent at the time. In short, Invisa's curatorial projects were carried out as acts of criticality embedded in the very same institutional structures that he sought to transgress. So he's kind of working from within the exhibition, from within the context that he's actually criticizing as well. As mentioned before, Invisa sought to expand the practices of curating as well as to contest the notion of the West as center. Concerning the first aspiration, his projects have clearly contributed to paving the way for more wide-reaching and transculturally networked and cross-disciplinary forms of knowledge production within the field of the curatorial. As for the last aspiration, however, Invisa's post-colonial attempts to deconstruct these Western-centric notions of art and curating have been both celebrated, but they have also been highly criticized. Qintao Wu has, for example, taken a critical stance and argued that although the art project staged at the Castle exhibition in connection with Document 11 were clearly intended to contest notions of the West as center, a surprising large number of the artists presented were actually from Europe or the United States. Criticisms have also been raised by Peter Schengdahl, Anthony Downey, and Oliver Machar, among others. They have, in different ways, remained skeptical of Invisa's capacity to counter traditional notions of center and periphery without subsuming and misrepresenting and excluding artists from the global south and turning post-colonial critique into mere spectacle, or as that which they call festivalism. So without necessarily subscribing to this rather harsh criticism and envisioning Document 11 as just another example of that which they call mixing entertainment and softcore politics, unquote. This is Schengdahl's way of putting it. Without necessarily kind of subscribing to this point of view, I agree that curatorial work as in a well-established, large-scale institution such as Documenta obviously poses certain challenges in terms of having to negotiate these conflicting interests with, for example, marketing departments or funding bodies. I think that's quite obvious if you're working on this scale, I would say. Also, I agree that changing not just the content, but the very terms of exhibition making requires a decolonization of the institutional structures and also of the practices. This is exactly what CAMP has sought to do. So this is why I'm now going to turn attention to the practice of CAMP and talk about how they have sought to reinterpret the practice of Invisa. Actually, you shouldn't be looking at this now, so this is just a teaser, but I'll get back to it just in a short while. I will argue that Curatorisk Aktion have actually actively used their local embeddedness. In other words, they use their specific situatedness in Denmark as an incentive to found a theme-based exhibition venue dedicated to showing artworks that articulate radical critiques of Western immigration, refugee and asylum politics, so some of the topics that Anna has already dealt with in her presentation. And they created a place that reflects on the experience of forced migration while also, and this is important, seeking to stimulate encounters and greater understanding between displaced people and the Danish publics. And now you may actually look at the slide because this is the mission statement of Curatorisk Aktion. So in their words, as the curators have stated, the objective is, through art, to stimulate greater understanding between displaced people and the communities that receive them, and to stimulate new visions for a more inclusive and equitable migration, refugee, and asylum policy. Yeah. CAMP is unique, I will argue, in the sense that there are no other exhibition venues in Scandinavia that have worked consistently and persistently on migration issues in this way, and no one that does so within the framework of a bottom-up driven community center. The exhibitions presented within the framework of CAMP have materialized in both physical and media spaces and comprise different kinds of participation, public discourse, activism, and political protest, and acts of solidarity. So this is another word that will pop up quite soon as well. So I will now zoom in on an example of this, namely the group exhibition Decolonizing Appearance, that was realized as part of the exhibition program called State of Integration. Thematically, this exhibition, which was guest curated by Nicholas Mirtsov, focused on how appearance is used to classify, segregate, and rule human beings in today's colonially structured world, as well as on how this regime can be actively challenged. Through photography, video, installation, and text, the exhibition created constellations of art projects reflecting on the issue of appearance within this matrix of the colonial. For example, I'll just show you some images here. For example, in the case of Jane Jean Kajsen's staged family portrait, this is the one top left, which reverses the dynamic within the transnational adoptive family by portraying a supposedly Asian American couple with their 9-year-old Danish-born daughter. Another example is Karl Pope's poster installation, The Badass Smell of Roses, which you see top right, which reflects on Black pride and queer identity. Importantly, in this context, Decolonizing Appearance did not only address the power-related issues of appearance by presenting art projects within this exhibition space of camp. The politically positioned exhibition also experimented with discursively oriented and activist approaches to curating, as a series of exhibition-related events were conducted here in Trampoline House, enabling the events to create these, what the curators call spillovers between the Trampoline House and camp. So this is what I will be talking about now, that's the bottom picture. So for example, Decolonizing Assembly was organized and led by the New York-based MTL collective that joins research and activism with artistic practice. They created a forum for asking politically mobilizing questions such as, and I quote, how can the colonized have the right to look, the right to be seen, in short, the right to appear? What would happen when appearance is decolonized? And what has to happen for decolonization to take place where you live? Unquote. The last question is kind of typical of how Decolonizing Appearance, and in particular MTL's assembly, sought to address its public. The you being addressed, what should happen where you live. So this you being addressed here was an openly defined you that could be inhabited by persons with very different positionalities. On that particular day when the assembly took place, it implicated a mix of people participating in this assembly on the history of colonialism and the current call for decolonization, and it included both people that were very sympathetic towards the project, but also people that were very critical, and of course also people that were positioned somewhere in between these. As was the case with many of the other components of the exhibition, MTL Collective's assembly called forth a mixed public of different national backgrounds and political positions. In doing so, I will argue that it presented a turn towards that which political theorist Oliver Marchand has termed activist art or artivism, and which he understands to be art that employs strategies of political activism in the attempt to stage political struggles and form these new alliances of solidarity. And this is where we get to post-migrant public spaces. The constant interweaving of camp's activities with those of Trampoline House and its multicultural community center has played a central role in camp's continuous work to draw critical attention to the situation of refugees and migrants. This unique combination of exhibition space and community center has clearly also helped to create interfaces between art audiences refugees, asylum seekers, activists, etc. When speaking about these, I propose to use the term post-migrant public spaces, which is a term that Anna and I have been kind of co-developing in our research project. By doing so, I wish to suggest that they are plural and sometimes conflictual domains of social encounter, shaped under the impact of both former and ongoing migration. So unlike the notion of the nation as a public sphere, the term post-migrant doesn't define a public by means of national borders. On the contrary, it foregrounds this idea of transcultural entanglement, that is the complex transformation of cultures and communities and of people's sense of identity and belonging through encounters. And these are, of course, some of the encounters you can see here in the images. Such transcultural entanglements have come to the fore in the case of Trampoline House and camp. As multicultural and also multilingual, they facilitated face-to-face encounters between displaced people and the receiving communities. The ambition to produce highly diverse publics was evident right from the beginning in the way the curators affiliated with camp have worked from a position of embeddedness and solidarity, and in the way they have consciously orchestrated camp's activities in Trampoline House to engage and to interweave the different kinds of publics that enter the spaces. In doing so, camp succeeded in creating post-migrant public spaces that were relatively open forums, providing the indefinite publics that emerged within these with a place to thematize and discuss and act on issues related to migration, asylum seeking and integration, as well as exploring how art can stimulate engagements with these issues and foster solidarity among people. Now, importantly, the art space engaged in the creation of post-migrant public spaces over longer periods of time. This is also something that I have been discussing with some of you before tonight. So this idea of time or the durational aspect is central, I would argue. This is at odds with the usual practice of globalized exhibition making and the fleeting encounters between audiences and artworks in transit between venues. As a long-term thematic curatorial project, camp generated repeated forms of coming together that engage many different people over time and that help build that which the curators refer to as sustainable infrastructures. And I think this is an interesting concept, something that's quite thought-provoking. Such open-ended processes, of course, permit tensions to surface, but they also allow for the building of solidarity. In other words, they allow for the creation of that which Naika Foroutan, as Anna previously mentioned, has termed post-migrant alliances. That is strategic bridge building between migrant and non-migrant actors who pursue a common goal. So by bringing together different people based on a shared experience, for example, of migration or racism or discrimination, or on a common political stance on migration and diversity, post-migrant alliances enable new interest-based relationships to develop beyond these traditional homogeneous peer groups. This is the cover of a publication. It came out when camp was closed last year, and it's a book that I find highly recommendable, actually, that gives insights into the whole process behind camp as an exhibition space. So it presents a lot of the projects that have been realized there, but it's also meant to work as a kind of a guide if other institutional spaces would be interested in experimenting in similar ways. Yeah, so at this point I would like to conclude the tracing of Invisa's legacy from Documenta 11 and to camp in Trampoline House with a glimpse of the future and a possible closing of the circle of this curatorial inspiration. As mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, Curatorisk Aktion, that is the curators behind the project, their participation in the preparation of Documenta 15 resulted in the closure of camp So this is why it's called status. And since then, the trampoline house has also closed, unfortunately, due to lack of funding. So it doesn't exist anymore. But this is not the end of the story. While Frederikke Hansen joined One Gruppa's curatorial team in the fall of 2019, Tone Olav Nielsen chose to stay within the local context and coordinate a group of trampoline house representatives, which has actually been a very difficult task also, I mean, given that we're all wearing masks now. Well, I'm not when speaking, so that's one of the advantages of standing up here, but it's been really difficult due to Corona to actually coordinate this group, so that's been somewhat of an extra challenge. Yeah, so as one of several collectively organized projects rooted in the arts, the group has been invited to develop over the extended 3-year period preceding the opening of Documenta next year, and I quote, alternative ways of sharing material and non-material resources, unquote. And this should be based on the concept of lumbung. I'll just show you here. Yeah. And the values of solidarity, collectivity, and sustainability at the core of One Gruppa's curatorial strategy for Documenta. So I won't go into details here, but just say that what you see here in the image is this lumbung construction, which is how should I put it? A meeting place, a place for coming together within an Indonesian context, but it's also a method that One Gruppa and Frederikke Hansen, who is part of the curatorial team now, are exploring how to work in this way in a curatorial context. Now, thinking about, and I'm coming to the end now, so thinking about these values and speaking about them in Athens tonight makes me want to end by revisiting a text by the architect and activist Stavros Stavridis called What is to be Learned on Athens and Documenta 14 so far. This article was published in After All as a retrospective critique of Documenta 14, which was realized here in Athens in 2018. In the article, Stavridis notes that Athens is, and I quote again, a more multicultural city than it used to be, unquote. And he goes on to say that instead of presenting immigrants and refugees as, I quote again, obstacles to overcoming national humiliation, or even as the very cause of it, unquote, one should look for exchanges among the city's current inhabitants beyond these hostilities. Such exchanges, he claims, are primarily connected to cultural and ethnical cross-fertilizations. And I hope this resonates with what I've been talking about. Yeah. So paraphrasing the title of the last Documenta and reflecting specifically on cultural entanglements as well as former and ongoing forms of migration, he argues that, and I quote again, rather long quote, but I'm, as I said, getting to the end now. He says, if one can learn something from Athens, it is that disempowered and exploited people may only resist collectively. The lesson of Athens lies not in the reinvention of individual freedom. Instead, one needs to study carefully the multifarious networks of solidarity that expand in, against, and hopefully beyond crisis. It is possible that art will profit from such a lesson by becoming more modest. Artists may learn how to listen and how to nourish imaginaries of social emancipation. Will the forthcoming exhibition support such an attitude? Will the institutional, economic, and cultural affinities of the Documenta organization encourage such approaches to art? We need to wait and see, unquote. Now, I will argue that we are still kind of in this waiting position right now. So, what further transformations of Invisa's legacy will result from the kind of folding of camp and trampoline house into Documenta remains, for example, at this point in time, an open question. We don't know yet. However, I think it will be very interesting to see if some of the critiques that have been raised both against Invisa's Documenta 11, but also against the last Documenta here in Athens, if they can be countered this time by consciously seeking to work with more collaborative, durational, and sustainable approaches to curating, and by exploring the possibilities of creating post-migrant alliances of solidarity that develop beyond homogeneous peer groups. So, on this note of hope and curiosity, I'll end my presentation now. So, thank you.